Okay.
Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome all of our parents of students who will be attending the in-person educational opportunities through the Boone and Winnebago County School Districts. We brought this together. We've collected all of your questions and compiled it. I have an assistant here, Katie Kelly, who will be going through the questions. We've grouped them in kinds of content area so that, as questions came through that were similar, we've grouped them together so we could provide some overall responses. We will be posting the questions and all of the responses. We received over 55 questions, which we grouped together in different content areas. We recognize that this is kind of the beginning opportunity to kind of have some dialogue about what the schools have done to help prepare to bring the students into an in-person learning environment, recognizing how important that is over the next several months as we prepare, as we begin to implement, and we return our children to an in-person learning environment. First of all, I want to thank all of our parents, our faculty, our teachers, our superintendents, our leaders, the school nurses who have helped put together many of the guidance documents that you will be referring to, that you've been seeing, the hard work that they've put in over the last 6 weeks. So we anticipate this will take about an hour and a half to get through most of the questions. And so Katie is going to lead them off, and I'm going to respond to them. And then we can do some follow-up if we have some time at the end.
Okay, great. So we'll get started with our first group of questions. Our first group is going to be about cleaning. So our first question will be, will the students or faculty be responsible for cleaning desks and chairs after each class before students rotate rooms for classes?
Well, all the schools have committed they will be providing cleaning supplies in every classroom. The cleaning of desks and chairs does not need to be routinely done between class changes unless the students are eating at the desks. Students and teachers should sanitize their hands upon entry into a classroom and upon exiting. And in some environments, students may be actually asked to clean their desk when they come into the room. We recognize we're probably not so good cleaning for others, but we're probably better at cleaning for ourselves. So before we'd sit down and take that class, desk, we might be wiping off that space and surface. But the most important thing that we've learned throughout this pandemic is the importance of hand washing. So making sure that children sanitize their hands upon entry into the classroom and then upon exit is most important.
Great. Our second question is, what is appropriate protocol for cleaning buses? Should they be thoroughly cleaned after each route?
The guidance on this is kind of a combination of guidance for both school buses and the general kind of mass transit. School buses will be cleaned and disinfected at the start of each shift and after transporting students. They will be following CDC guidelines and using FDA-approved List N, it's a separate word, the letter N, agents.
What cleaning should be done on a daily basis and with what supplies?
Schools will be cleaned and disinfected at the end of each day and will be cleaned frequently touched surfaces throughout the day. Deep cleaning will be done when there is a confirmed positive case. And again, they will be using any of the agents listed on List N, which we provided a link to in the guidance documents as well. So you can see all the different cleaning products that can be used in a school environment.
Has the school hired more staff to aid in the extra cleaning that should be done regularly?
Well, I don't have information on every school, but schools have identified the appropriate personnel for cleaning to ensure compliance with the recommendations. So some may have additional staff, additional cleaning times, and or increased contracts in the evening and after school hours.
If the bus had not been cleaned between routes, would other schools be affected?
So this question kind of seems to flow from if there was a child or a student that became ill on the bus, would that impact if the bus had not been cleaned between the routes? Once again, we would then have to take a look at, we will be looking at that social distancing. So many of the schools have implemented some kind of a seating plan, which I know is very foreign to all of us, right? We like to pick the seat. I don't know, I used to like to ride in the back of the bus, to feel the bumps. But in this day and date, you'll be sitting in assigned seating. So we know who the kids were that were 6 feet in front, 6 feet behind, and 6 feet to the side. So that, again, we would take a look and identify those students in those seating arrangements that would be considered contacts regardless of the cleaning protocol in place.
How often should bathrooms be cleaned? RPS has not increased their cleaning crew from Airmark. How will they be able to do their extra deep cleaning when they barely get their regular cleaning accomplished?
Well, first of all, I want to make sure that all schools have addressed this through their leadership. And so the idea being that there would be sanitizing of contact surfaces between the use of cohorts. So that does not involve deep cleaning. That would involve wiping off the, the countertops, the handles, those kinds of things would be done at minimally from 1 hour to 2 hours. And then again, they would do a routine cleaning per their scheduled protocol. And then again in the evening after the school hours, so at the close of day. So again, all of these details have been worked out through the school contracts, or if there's personnel, some schools still have custodial staff on board and they've been trained in those procedures as well.
Schools, especially RPS 205, were not being cleaned prior to COVID-19. So there are numerous concerns from parents and staff about this issue. What will the role of the Winnebago County Health Department in holding them or other districts accountable? Can parents and staff call in complaints to your office?
Well, this is similar to masking and all other kinds of complaints, is that I always come back to we're not going to police ourselves out of pandemic. So first of all, this cleaning concept is one you'll notice that we've asked, and most of the guidance issued by the Illinois State Board of Education, the Illinois Department of Public Health, our health department as well, is to remove the amount of extra items in a classroom because that will facilitate cleaning at the end of the day, so that the cleaning crews can quickly go in and make sure that they sanitize surfaces. So in addition, I know that the RPS has installed electrostatic cleaning devices. We know that some of the other schools have different mechanisms that they are putting in place as well. Understanding that it is during this time frame, cleaning is utmost importance. But I want to come back to, first of all, work with your school administration. If you find that a classroom or your child's complaining or you notice something's not being cleaned appropriately, bring it up to leadership and management so they can work on it first. And again, with the idea being that when we will follow up, we will go in with them and asking what are their protocols? Can they show us the cleaning schedules? If there's a case or repeated cases within a same environmental space, then obviously we'll be working with our environmental health team to go in and identify if there are other factors that are contributing to the transmission of the COVID in that particular setting. But I want to really, again, instill with everyone, it's all of our responsibilities to keep our workspaces clean, to again make sure that we are picking up things so that the cleaning crew at the evening does not have to clean around our desk items. I probably, if you saw my desk, you would say I'm not living that. I need to do a better job on that. So our team that comes in after, if I've got things off my desk, they can quickly clean it and sanitize it. But again, the electrostatic also helps because again, that it really does sanitize in addition to surface clean.
Okay, we're going to move into our next group of questions, which are all about social distancing and cohorting. So our first question in that category will be, how is keeping kids in one class with masks and 6 feet away from each other helping them socially?
So I want to come back to the guidance, and I know these are challenging because it seems polar opposite when we say social distance and then social learning. But the major, I'm going to say, organizations that address children and learning, the American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Federation of Teachers, the National Education Association, have all issued a joint position on the importance of in-person classroom education. And frankly, we're all having to learn to adapt to this new environment. How do we stay connected? How do we interact socially with each other while at the same time maintaining physical distance? I come back to really, it's all of our roles to help our children adapt during this time frame so that they understand the concept, but then still learn how to socially engage. So instead of high-fiving, you can still smile and your eyes can express a smile through your mask. You can do a wave. You can do a thumbs up. We're going to have to teach children those cues so that they understand how they can protect themselves with social distancing and still maintain social contact. So part of it is modeling, part of it is the role of the teachers in the educational system, as well as then all of us in the community. When you see a child, make sure that you're making eye contact with them. Remember, that's what they can see. Smile, wave, thumbs up. Those are all parts of keeping them socially connected and still physically distanced in a safe learning environment.
Why is 48 students per bus or 2 per seat appropriate? How is this actually following 6 feet apart requirements?
Well, first of all, I come back to, we're talking about bus again, and this is the current group size, as we know, is 50. And again, the seating arrangement on the bus, for those of you who didn't like to sit with your siblings, you will be sitting with your siblings now. Remember I said I like to sit in the back of the bus and feel the bumps? I also didn't like sitting next to my brother. So there you go. But right now, the 2 per seat, really, we try and encourage households to sit together. But again, the idea being a bus ride is in a controlled environment. If we know where children are seated, we know who's within that 6 feet in front, 6 feet behind, and 6 feet to the side. And oftentimes households are traveling together on a bus. The idea being that we will never exceed the capacity of a group size of 50, so that we are always aware who's on the bus, where they're sitting, and the idea being that you have to help your children understand that this is not free roaming time on the bus.
Okay, the next 3 questions kind of go together. So I'm going to read all 3 before you give your response. The first one is, with 20 kids per classroom, can they keep them from 6 feet apart? The second one will be, will 205 separate kids into pods, small groups of learners who will study and move and eat and socialize together and separately from other kids and make contact tracing possible? The third question is, Illinois is currently in phase 4, which allows all gatherings of 50 people or fewer. Roughly 50% of RPS students opted for in-person learning. Due to this, RPS has decided all in-person students will attend school on Mondays and Thursdays. There will be over 800 students in a high school at a time. How will we be able to control exposure, as RPS has said, and how can we allow this many students, not including the adults, in one building at a time when we are in the revitalization phase? Students will be in the halls all at the same time, with the only precautions of a mask given. Teachers will see up to 100 students a day. This is not safe for the students and the adults in the building.
So there's actually kind of 2 concepts within here. In the elementary grades, we're seeing a lot of cohorting, meaning that we've got small group size, classrooms of 20, 25, with a teacher and potentially the aide, depending upon what the classroom structure is for that particular school. And that group they will learn together, they will play together, they will eat lunch together, they will use the washroom together at the same time. So at that point in time, you're controlling the volume of individuals. So those cohorts, though, my classroom of 25, let's say I'm a first grade teacher, will not mix with Katie's classroom of 25 during the day. We might have done some joint or collaborative learning during that time frame, but to keep our cohort small and the number of exposures and contexts low within that given day, we will keep those numbers low and they will be cohorted together. But if you're the parents, I need your help as well now, because the teachers will have done a great job. The schools will work very hard to cohort them. But if on the weekend, you are then breaking through those cohorts and exposing your children to multiple different areas and kids that they're not normally with during the school day, you create more contacts in a day. And so being thoughtful, intentional, deliberate about how many contacts you want your child to be exposed to, because at the end of the day, in-person learning is contingent on us keeping that cohort together so that we can keep exposures low. Now, high schools move around a lot. So in between was the middle school. So I'll talk a little bit about that and some of the methods that are being used in the middle schools, where they begin to change classes for their specialty areas. They may have some of the schools are doing what's called the teachers are actually rotating through. So the teacher will maintain their 6 feet of social distancing at their area where they're teaching or giving their lecture or content materials. And then again, the kids will be the ones sitting together in the cohort. So that group of students will be there, and the English teacher will rotate in, the math teacher will rotate in, the history teacher, and so on. When it's a laboratory class, for instance, you think, well, it's hard for a teacher to maintain social distance. You're going to be working with a kid to help them measure or do something, an experiment. In those, you would then keep the lab partners stable and together. So for instance, Katie and I would be lab partners. We would always be the same lab partners together, so that again, the teacher being exposed would be in a very short distance of time with us. so that we keep the cohort small. In high school, with class changing periods, the average class changing time period is now about 7 minutes. So that's well below the threshold of 15 minutes within 6 feet of social distancing. They will be wearing masks. They will not be permitted to go to their lockers. So there's no, really, it's to avoid congregating in the hallways. For those in the days that used to like to hang out at their locker, see their friend as they went by, they will be moving along, and there will be hall monitors in most of these to keep the students moving to the next classroom environment. In high school, you, as an instructor or teacher, you're typically standing 6 feet away, and there'll be markings in the room. Make sure that you're maintaining that. The students' desks will be placed out as far apart as they can be, and yes, facial coverings are the new dress code for our class in-person experience, with the idea being that minimize the risk and the exposure. Now, certain classes, we acknowledge that is going to be different, like driver's education. We're talking about science, and again, we're cohorted. So we're in the past, I might have changed lab partners or driver's ed partners throughout a semester. I will be cohorted with my team, which might be the instructor, my partner, and that's how we're going to continue to move through. But we will be wearing face coverings in those scenarios. Wherever we cannot maintain that particular, we're going to have to really work toward making sure that we're using our face coverings and that they're worn appropriately, covering our nose and our mouth, that they're not chin straps or chin guards or headbands. The idea being that that's how we're going to protect each other in those circumstances to minimize our risk. And I really want to be clear about this. We are minimizing the risk. The risk is not zero, but we can reduce this risk significantly if we follow the guidelines and really practice them at the highest level that moving forward.
Can you explain exactly what cohorting means and how it will work in the classroom? How will this method work to identify students or staff who are in close contact or need to be quarantined?
Well, a cohort is really a small grouping. So for instance, we'll go with our 20 students and the teacher and the aide. So they are a cohort together. They're going to be spending typically especially in the elementary grades, and we're going to really kind of cohorting is used mostly in that arena. We'll be together for our classroom throughout the day, our learning day, our playtime, so that if one of the children were to, let's say, you get the call that the child has contracted COVID, the number of individuals that would have been exposed would be the other children in the cohort and the teacher and the aide. Now, some scenarios may be even the cohort then even smaller, so that there might be work tables, for instance. There might be a group of 5 in a cluster of learning and another 5, but let's go with the maximum. So that would be the maximum versus some of the collaboratives where we might have had 60 or 70 exposures in that particular. And once again, we would look at the activities of that particular classroom with that teacher and that aide. What are the activities that they are doing throughout the day? Are they using manipulatives like, other kinds of activities? How much sharing of items are going on? Are there other children in that particular? And that group, if we had to quarantine, so we've got the one sick child would go into isolation. So everyone's clear, sick means isolate. And then the other would go into quarantine, and we would go into a remote learning session at that point in time. We would go into our 2 weeks of remote learning. So while we are returning to in-person, I want everyone to understand that does not mean that it's only in person. We understand that there are going to be some waves of this going on, even with our best efforts, our best attempts to cohort and keep it together, that we may have these waves of infection, and that we've got to be prepared to do our in-person, switch to remote, and then come back after the quarantine to our in-person. So they're calling, now the state has come out and they're calling them adaptive learning sessions. It's really kind of identifying that we're going to go through those waves. So that's how cohorting works. So the smaller you can keep the cohort, the lower the exposure. But again, with the idea being that functions well in the elementary grades in the pre-K.
In most secondary schools, there will be 200 students in the hallways or more during passing times. Is that acceptable? For example, RISA has 1,300 students. Only 600 will be learning in school, but that means each hallway will have approximately 200 students.
Well, I'm going to come back to this concept a lot because it really, you have to think about it in all different kinds of ways. But exposure is not simply a function of being in a place. It really is a function of time and duration, right? So again, how long am I in space? So how close am I into the person and how long am I in contact? In a hall passing, I really should not be within 6 feet of someone for more than a few minutes as I pass through to my next school. And that will be the role of the monitors in the hallways to make sure that people are not bunching up. Do I expect that our kids will be flashing pictures of like what we saw in Georgia? Yes, I do, because the class change periods will bring people out of the classroom. Now, every school is doing it a little bit different. Some schools are actually spacing their class time periods, they're phasing it. So it might be the bell rings at the hour and classrooms 1 through 4 change out. So it reduces the number. And then at 10 minutes after the hour, another classroom changes out. But again, the idea being that as all of us as adults in the classroom setting is really teaching children really to avoid that bunching up someplace where we would be piling up into a particular area. The idea being hallway passing should be, get you to your classroom as quickly as possible and into your classroom so that we are not hanging out in the halls together in large groups. That's where we are going to really have to rely on students to understand that concept. So the 15-minute rule and really the number, the duration of the 6 feet kind of coming together. And of course, everyone will be wearing a face covering. And for the students who cannot the colored face coverings, they'll be wearing their face shields.
Past practice has been when a sub is not available, students are split up and placed in other classrooms. No district seems to have put out any information on whether they have enough subs to cover classrooms, especially longer-term subs to cover for quarantine staff. Plus, based on past practice, subs move around the whole district. Has your office given districts any guidance in this area? Are splitting classrooms up and sending students to other rooms permissible? Is it still acceptable under our IDPH school guidelines for subs to be moving throughout the area?
So excuse me. I'm going to ask all of you what you think the response would be based on what I've just told you about 15 minutes, 6 feet in cohorting. And the answer is the schools have worked on subs to cohort their substitute teachers as well. The idea that I might float through 5 or 6 different districts, they've really had to kind of think this through a bit. In the past, splitting up classrooms when a sub could not be obtained would have been part of the standard. And again, you can understand why we would not want to do that, right? Because now my cohort of 20 is now 30. And so that's why we want to keep that from happening. Now, if it's a quarantine though, remember, if the teacher's quarantined, it's a household contact potentially there, not through the school setting, they might pull everyone into remote learning in that particular classroom rather than using a substitute teacher. So I want to come back, it depends on the circumstances, but we will not be blending classes together because that destroys the concept and really defeats the purpose of cohorting students to keep the number of contacts in a day low.
Okay, we are going to move on to our next category, which is health screening and exclusions. I'm going to read 2 questions before you give your response. The first question is, why are temperatures not being taken before a student enters school or the bus? We cannot rely on parents. Some already send their kids on medicine, hoping they make it through the day. The second question is, are bus drivers prepared to refuse transport to symptomatic children? Are schools prepared to assess children each morning? Are teachers able to identify children who should not be at school? Are parents prepared to retrieve ill children? Has this groundwork been established?
So I want to come back to, obviously this came from both the teacher and the parent perspective. And this is an appropriate lead in to the sense of it's a shared responsibility between both the school and the parents. Parents need to understand they should not be sending their children to school when they're sick. I mean, this is part of our pandemic 101 response. You need to keep your child at home. This is not the time to power through an illness. I said that multiple times in press briefings and releases about that, because I think those days of sending someone to school when they're ill creates a potential of an exposure that none of us would feel proud about. I think the other part of it is understanding what is the role of a bus driver. So why are some temping? The bus driver, their role is to safely transport children, to make sure that they get on and off the bus safely and they operate the vehicle safely. So when we looked at what the guidance was, we felt that putting the bus driver in charge of taking a temperature was not an appropriate role. It actually could be a distraction that could then impair the safety of the children coming onto the bus. So it's up to the parents' responsibility to make sure that the child is not ill when they put them on the bus stop to get on the bus. When they arrive at school, each school has a different physical layout. And I know that that's, we all have our kind of knowledge of where our school world is, how our school is laid out. Not every school is laid out that way. But the challenge for every school was to make sure that there was a temp checking in, so that there was some way to get them into their classroom. So it may be that they're temp checked when they come into their cohorted classroom. If there are multiple entrances, they may be assigned to assemble at multiple entrances so that the cohort assembles together, but they are not congregating out in the parking lot or an area where, again, where there's a lot of mixing of different students together. They're jamming up in those areas. So each school has worked through a process to really bring the children in as quickly as possible into the school setting, assess them for the beginning of the day, and then take the appropriate action. So again, I come back to parents, please, 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 we need your assistance on this to not send children into school knowing that they might be ill. And with the idea that they will be checked when they arrive. And then if there is an identified, then every school has a team kind of that works to identify and to help move a child that's been identified as screening positive out of that environment so they can be safely then really returned home as quickly as possible and assessed from that point. But understand, find out what the details are for your particular school. I have been at some schools that have multiple entrances, which will work very well. And I have others that maybe have one main kind of area. And so they're having to work through that. So the idea is that don't send a kid to school if you're sick. I'm going to repeat it again 3 times. And again, we will check them when they come into the school environment. But we want to make sure our bus drivers, their role is to get children safely into their seat and transport the children safely to the school. And that's what we want the bus drivers to be doing.
When flu season starts, what will protocol be and will it change? Who is in charge of watching COVID rooms at school? Are those people receiving special PPE and changing it if they enter back into regular school area?
The concern on this is really you won't see a significant change in protocols when the flu season starts. The schools all have designated health personnel who are responsible for the management of any sick child under their care until the parent or guardian reports to pick them up. School nurses and school health personnel are being fit tested for N95 respirator masks, and they will also be wearing gowns, face shields, and gloves when caring for an ill child. So again, they are being prepared and ready for that. Because again, as you know, and I think the question was alluding to, signs and symptoms of flu are very similar to signs and symptoms of COVID. And we have had outbreaks of seasonal flu within our school environments. So we ask again, this is the parent responsibility. Do not send your child to school if they are sick. Please keep them home. We will work with you. There are remote options, but you need to keep your child at home if they are ill. And it's also a good time for me to put a plug in to make sure that you get vaccinated against seasonal influenza. We want to keep that disease infection rate low in our community as well.
Will there be separate areas for kids who are sick but not with COVID symptoms?
Yes. Every school has determined an area for the COVID-like symptom individuals versus the non-COVID-like children. So that, again, they can try and keep them as separated as possible.
Are schools going to have any more nurses on hand to handle this? How about subs lists for teachers and other staff? Is there enough staff willing to teach in person?
I come back to schools have identified appropriate personnel for both health and educational instruction. And please refer to your particular school for any changes that might be going on at that particular location.
How much has your office helped individual schools in setting up their isolation or lounge rooms? Are you recommending they be staffed by school nurses? Did you help them get the proper PPE, including N95 fitted mask? Past practice has been sick children being sent back to classroom on a constant basis. Parents and staff were concerned about this practice before, but with COVID-19, it is more concerning.
And pretty much you're all going to be experts after this call, I'm sure of it. Yes, we've been very much engaged. Each setting is somewhat different, and I have to, be honest with you. Some have set up a separate room, some have set up a designated area. Rockford Public Schools is referring to their isolation rooms as student lounges because they felt like students might be frightened when they heard that term. All of the school nurses and school health personnel have been fit tested for N95 masks that would be required for the care of those types of individuals. Remember, those are the kinds of masks that protect the healthcare worker. They're not used for source control, so they're not put on the child. The child would still be wearing their face covering, cloth mask, and then the nurse or school health personnel would be wearing the N95 and the protective equipment. Both of our health systems have all stepped up to help us to do that N95 testing in our community. So we're very grateful for that, and our nurses are going through all of that at this particular time. Now, returning a child back to the classroom, and the answer is no, we will not be returning children back to a classroom who exhibit signs and symptoms of COVID. They will be in the designated isolation area in that particular school. The parent will be notified and they will be given appropriate instruction and direction on their next steps. And so many of them will try and exit the child out through a different door area so they're not walking back through the school to be picked up. So each school will be setting that up specifically regarding where parents should pick up their child. I know this is going to be disruptive to parents. So parents, once again, make sure that your contact information is current and up to date. That again, we've been really working with our employers in our community and the whole community and the whole nation to understand that this is not business as usual. This is not how we've had to do it before. We cannot allow you to wait 2 or 3 hours to pick up your child if we feel that they're exhibiting signs and symptoms of COVID-19. The school health personnel are going to work hand in glove with the health department. They will be notifying us so that we can then make the appropriate recommendation to get a child tested as quickly as possible, as well as working with the healthcare provider if they're going to rule out COVID and rule in another disease or infectious process.
Our next 3 questions go together, so I will read all 3 before you respond. With so many overlapping symptoms of COVID-19 and other illnesses and diseases, could you explain which ones will be used to quarantine staff or students? I've gotten conflicting information on this. For example, headaches can be a symptom of COVID-19, but I've heard if someone suffers from migraines, not to quarantine. The second question, I have a 13-year-old asthmatic child. Will she be forced to take COVID test if she has an asthma attack at school? The third question, according to the Illinois State Board of Education website, all students and staff sent home with COVID-like symptoms should be diagnostically tested. Student and staff should remain home from school until they receive the test results. Will you be recommending schools following these guidelines?
So I'm going to say hot off the press as of last night. It will be posted on the website because, again, we were all struggling with this. So the Illinois Department of Public Health issued guidance yesterday that addresses the evaluation of students and or staff. I want to be clear, who are presenting with signs or symptoms that could indicate a case of COVID-19. Once again, we will isolate those individuals as quickly and as promptly as possible. And then again, the recommendation is to test, to get a diagnostic test. Now, if the child's got a diagnostic asthma test and their doctor has identified and is going to give them a treatment, there is another pathway for all of that. But I also want to make sure, this is a good plug, that all of those school health exams should be on file, up to date, accurate with your child's health histories and conditions, along with medications that they routinely take for their condition. Because again, part of the discussion of having that is understanding, and the question came up about migraines, was on a call with the school nurses. If a child presents with a migraine headache that's typical of their migraines, and you find out that they haven't been taking their medication, then again, the pathway is to get them back to their provider to get them on their migraine medication versus to evaluate them for COVID. So again, there's no one symptom. They could be any of them, but you can have migraines and COVID. You can have strep throat and COVID. You can have influenza and COVID. We know that there is a significant amount of co-infection with COVID. So to simply say we're going to rule it out completely without evaluating the symptom, I think we recognize that that puts all of our students and our staff at risk in those environments. And so when there is a concern, when there's a doubt, we're going to isolate and get them out of the school environment and back into isolation at home with follow-up by the primary care providers.
Will you be recommending staff gets a COVID test prior to the start of school before they return to work?
There is no recommendation at present to have staff or students tested for COVID-19. You've heard about some of this being done on college campuses, right, before they come in and before they quarantine. But I have to come back to, and I tried to really kind of reinforce all of this and explain this. The COVID test is just a test in point in time. So I could test negative today and still be in an incubation based on an exposure that I had and be really still be able to transmit the virus. So testing alone is not our only mechanism of determining safety of entry into the school. So we're asking individuals, we've had our travel guidance up for a while. We've talked about the importance of quarantining as you come back, before you come back into the school environment. But even a test, and we come back, testing does not get you out of quarantine. So for instance, I've heard, well, if I go home and you quarantine me today and I get a test today and I'm negative, I can come back to work, right? And the answer is, it's not a get out of quarantine. A test is a point in time test only and does not confer, if it's only for that day that you're taking it, that we know of whether or not you have active infection. So we are not making a general guideline or recommendation based on the testing methodology and technology that we have today of a test.
All right, we're going to move right along into our next category of questions, which is quarantine and isolation. Our first question is going to be, what information will be shared with a parent when a child from their school or class shows symptoms? Why are we not requiring tests to be negative to return? Who decides on how many days everyone is at home if someone tests positive or even has the symptoms?
Well, first of all, this is not a disease where there's a lot of variability. There are very clear guidelines on how long people are in isolation or quarantine. So when a child, okay, so there are a couple of things that go on. We will work with that school to notify if there's been a case identified in the school. We will not provide details that would allow you to know who that child is. Now, in a class that needs to be quarantined, that letter and communication is different. So for instance, if my child's in a class where they're going to have to be quarantined, the letter will say that they've been exposed and they're going into a 2-week remote quarantine. It will not identify the child. Now, in this day of social media, I really want to caution people about making assumptions, sharing information, any of that. Because again, remember, our goal is to protect the confidentiality and privacy of everyone who's involved in the scenario. And I think, again, we can't make judgment calls about, were people intentionally exposed? Why did they come to school sick? Or why didn't they stay home? These are very difficult times, and no one knowingly exposes anyone. And I think we have to be thoughtful and kind about that. So we, as standard, protocol in terms of protecting privacy and confidentiality, do not release it, but we will inform when there's been an exposure and what actions need to be taken. Now, let's talk about how long does someone stay out? There is no variability on this at the present time. If you are a confirmed diagnosed case of COVID-19, so meaning your test positive, You are out for 10 days, of which 24 hours must be fever-free without fever-reducing medication. So no Tylenol, no ibuprofen, no acetaminophen, whatever, if you're using generic, or the idea being that you have to be fever-free. Quarantine is 14 days. Now, we've been talking through this in some of the schools. So let's say there's a case in a classroom, and you're now experts with me. So we're going to isolate that child for their 10 days. Let's say the teacher and their, other classmates are going to be quarantined because they were not, based on what we understood from their classroom day. We are going to work because it would be pretty clear, right, when one child could return earlier than the rest of their entire cohort. So that class that's going to remote then would pick up and do the remote learning. So understand that do not make assumptions about who it is. There is no benefit to doing that. If you are a contact and there's greater concern, you will be contacted by the health department and notified that you are a contact and the instruction and direction that you need to take.
If someone who rides the bus tests positive or has symptoms, does everyone from the bus need to isolate?
And the answer is no. Again, it's people sitting within 6 feet of that particular student. That is why, though, the bus seating schedule is critical. But if the kids were all over the bus, then we'd have to get to the whole bus, which is why the role of the bus driver is to make sure the children go to their assigned seat and they safely transport the children to the school. Parents, it's your role to help the student understand that you need to sit next to your brother or sister, even if you are not happy sitting next to them for that ride, because it really then limits the number of exposures that could occur on a bus if a child were to become ill.
Has the school hired more staff to aid in the extra cleaning that should be done regularly?
And again, this is I would say all the schools have worked hard to make sure that they have adequate personnel to implement the protocols and procedures that are being recommended.
What type of mask are the best to wear for students and staff to be safe? Cloth or single use?
Well, again, when you look at the CDC guidance on masks, it is cloth masks or face coverings without the valves. There was a lot of discussion that you could buy some online that had the fancy valves. And the Illinois State Board of Education, along with the Illinois Emergency Management and Illinois Department of Public Health, are providing masks, cloth masks, one for each student and faculty member, and face shields. The cloth or the disposable masks really have been reserved for the healthcare worker section, and there will be some disposables available in the school for children whose masks become soiled during the day, or become into the straps fall off and they cannot keep wearing them, so that they can be used as an alternative to that. But right now, with the recommendation, cloth is the method that we are using for face coverings in our school environment, as well as then the recommendation for daily laundering. So you want to get a few of them that work well for your child if you're the parent. And so that theirs, you might want to put their names on them if they all like pink, or they all like blue, or all like Superman, so that that your child is returning with their own mask, and then washing them on a daily basis, so that they are bringing a clean one to school every day.
What numbers would Region 1 or Winnebago need to exhibit to close schools and do all online learning? Is there a set number or percent?
Again, we've been working on these metrics, and for those of you who've been tuned in, we've been looking at our percent positivity, right? And we've talked about things that would take us from a community transmission standpoint would be metrics where the positivity rate was 8% or greater for 3 or more consecutive days. And then we also look at our case per 100,000. So in our case scenario, we're talking about more than equal to or more than 50 new cases over a 7-day period. So again, we're looking at these metrics. The state, we went into orange for a little bit, for a week, where our case rate was higher than the 50. We had moved into that area, but our positivity rate was still in the blue. We're now back in the blue. So these are metric wide. And again, Illinois Department of Public Health has issued a table on guidance, so we will be following those as well. And so with the idea being right now that our infection rate is low, our positivity rate is low, that we can begin to prepare and really begin to move into in-person learning. If at any point there was a concern with the community metrics being too high, again, we would not be moving forward with this plan. There might be times as well if there's sustained transmission in a school. So let's say we have a school where we have 3 or 4 grades impacted, and we clearly understand that cohorting and maintaining has not worked for them. That particular school may be closed, but not all schools in the district, right? If all the other metrics are well for the community. So we will be continuing to publish out those metrics, keeping you informed. The Illinois Department of Public Health now has that up as a metric site as well, understanding that others in the region are going to be looking at as well for the kind of decision about in-person and remote, or the adaptive measures to be taken during school line. We talked about those adaptive, meaning we return to remote. But understand that we are watching those metrics. The science is guiding us through this, with the understanding that if infection rates in our community become, really unmanageable, and we know that there's too much, we're concerned about the safety of our staff, our children, our teachers, then we are going to then say we need to pull back and do remote learning.
Why are other larger districts around us opting for all online while RPS is still pushing for in-person? Are they fully prepared, or should they wait a trimester to be fully prepared? Some departments have not heard any specific information. So how will 2 weeks be enough time for them to plan it out?
Well, I think that first of all, there are a couple of things. One, all response is local, and our numbers have been local, and we've been monitoring our local numbers. So given our numbers within Winnebago County and our region, we feel that we can move forward with this. I'm not sure that you can appreciate that the schools, we've been meeting for over 6 weeks to look at the guidance, look at the numbers, and move through that with plans. The idea being that we knew from the start that even offering in-person to our families and our community would require that we always be prepared to go to some variation on remote learning. You'll often hear that referred to as hybrid versus all remote. But the idea being that there is a case and you have to be quarantined, or their community transmission is too high, that we would then go from our in-person to our remote. So I'm not responsible for other school districts in our community. I'm not responsible for other counties. I'm responsible as a health administrator for Winnebago County. And so I look at our numbers and I look at what we can do within our region to balance our metrics, to make sure that we have opportunities to really address the in-person learning needs of many of our children, and at the same time, really address the health and safety concerns of our community.
I am sending my kids for in-person learning, but concerned, as both my kids have seasonal allergies. Will they be allowed in school, as many of the COVID symptoms are similar to seasonal allergy symptoms? What determinations will be made for these situations?
So again, I come back to making sure your child's health history and their medications are up to date. And again, we will be following the Illinois Department of Public Health guidance. So with all of our school health nurses, we will be evaluating the student against the symptoms. And if, again, with the understanding that if your child presents with symptoms that are new in onset, that are not being appropriate, again, managed at that point, we will be working with you to get them to their primary care provider for evaluation to rule out COVID-19 as a diagnosis.
Okay, our next 3 questions go together, so I'll read all 3 before you respond. The first one is, shouldn't schools have upgraded air handling systems before opening? Many schools have windows that don't open or open 3 inches. The second is, does each teacher in classroom and building have the resources that opening safely requires? Michael Olstrom and others have emphasized universal masks, 6 feet at all times, hand washing, and air quality purifiers, high functioning HVAC system. Has 205 prepared physically? Do rooms have air purifiers with HEPA filters? The last one is, how does the health department know the ventilation systems in the schools will not spread the virus? Some have windows and some have no windows. Does the AC spread the virus?
Okay, so this is about physical plant and air exchange and HVAC systems. So I'm going to generally lump some of this together. The guidance, when we review it, has been produced by both the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and really the Environmental Protection Agency on this to schools. And so some of these strategies that they have identified to improve the air quality, as several of the people, including opening windows as safe, use of air conditioners with outside air intakes or vents, and increasing fresh air intake into the system. Some of our schools are using fans, and they are permissible, but they have to blow it away from direct contact to any one student's face. And schools have added HEPA filtration, UV lighting, and ultrasonic cleaning throughout. So again, each strategy helps to reduce the transmission in those scenarios.
Would you be willing to send your staff out to schools prior to or after they have started to point out inadequate procedures?
Well, first of all, I want to tell everyone we are engaged in active response, and we have made some visits already to some of the schools. And we will continue to review the specific plans shared by the schools. And again, I want to come back to, this is constantly evolving. I just shared with you guidance that was released last night. We've been moving forward with our guidance and our collective wisdom of working through the documents. And now we will take a look at some of the others and see if there are changes or differences. And so being able to modify those as needed. If there are questions regarding a particular school area, we will go on site to work on those to address those particular needs. But I want to make sure that everyone's aware that we are actively engaged with response and support the schools in whatever they need to support them in their efforts to open safely for in-person education.
What are the protocols for students and staff who test positive for COVID-19? What are the protocols for those they have come in contact with?
We have, for everyone, we've detailed the guidance in the school health guidance document, and it provides an overview of case investigation and contact tracing, because we know people have questions about that. And we kind of addressed that earlier about the whole concept of isolating the ill individual and then quarantining those who have been within, 6 feet for more than 15 minutes of time.
Each RPS 205 building has a separate plan. Will your department be reviewing each school's plan?
And the answer is that we've developed the guidance because, again, with the total number of schools and the total number of configurations, that the guidance helps them to then put their plan together. If there are specific plans they've requested us to review, we've been doing that.
Secondary students are not in cohort groups like elementary classes. They switch rooms every hour. So if a student comes down with the virus, what students will be quarantined? Kids in all of his classes, students in desks near his in each of his classes, all of his teachers, students that sit near him at lunch, students that sit next to him on the bus. If a teacher has the virus, who is quarantined? All of the students, all 150 of them, other teachers?
Okay, this is like those multi-word problems, right? The if-thens. So we're going to come back to the basic concepts, and I can keep coming back to, we would have to know about that teacher's, or let's start with a teacher and we'll work back to the student, because really the principles are the same. We have to understand the routine of that particular individual. So we've talked about the seating arrangements, the importance of a seating chart within those classrooms. So we understand who's within 6 feet, and then what is their typical day like. With the six, in the middle school, they start to begin to change classes. What classes do they go? What were, and again, we're not concerned about the hallway gathering as we are about when they got into the classroom, where did they sit? what were they doing in the classroom? Was it a science class or a manipulative class where they might be touching, an art class where they're have their hands on objects that might be shared with others? And then who do they eat lunch with, right? How do they eat lunch? We know that typically the lunches will be somewhat restricted to groups of 50. And so their lunch period, who is it that they sit at the table with? Who are their buddies that they hang out with at the lunch table? And not only will we have to know about the students, we'll have to know what they do in the after hours. Are they part of a scouting or religious ed or some other kinds of activities that are not affiliated with the school, so that we understand who really is most at risk in those contacts. And probably the most at risk, I would say, are your household contacts. So oftentimes when we see with some of the children, right, they typically have siblings that might be in upper or lower grades. And so you might see a child, a sibling, a brother, sister being quarantined from, the elementary school and potentially the high school. And if you're the trifecta, then the teacher who's a parent of that child may also be involved if they're the household contact. But the idea being that we want to make sure that we understand who's been in that space, because those are the individuals at greatest risk for contracting the illness themselves. And so that 14-day period is meant to monitor them for symptoms. And so the importance of that, so that they are not being exposed and not exposing others during that time frame as well.
What if a student woke up with a slight fever and parent gave her Tylenol, so by the time she gets to school, her temperature has broken for a bit? Should students be asked questions to screen them as staff takes their temperature? For example, how do you feel? Did you take Tylenol this morning? Does anyone in your family have COVID-19?
The health screening is, first of all, most of the schools are using a self-certification before they come in, and that's one of the questions they're asking them about, their signs and symptoms. And again, I think we get to the point where at some point, yes, they will be again certified, when they come into the classroom. So those questions are being incorporated. It does not ask about every family member. So they'll ask if they're exposed to someone. I think we have to understand that no one is intentionally getting exposed or exposing others. The question is regarding, though, I think the importance of making sure that people understand, do not send your child to school if they're ill, and that children may develop a fever throughout the day. This is not uncommon in pediatrics. And so working through that, if a child becomes ill, quickly isolating and moving them out of the classroom. But every attempt will be made to kind of make sure that the children is not staying in a classroom for longer than need be with symptoms of COVID.
Are staff and students expected to self-quarantine if they have traveled in any of the areas deemed as hotspots by IDPH?
Well, I hope you were reading our hotspot information sooner than IDPH, because we started ours at the end of June, and we look at and we update it on Tuesday. And we identify areas that have higher rates of infection than Winnebago County in the state of Illinois, with the idea being that there's a higher rate of potential for community transmission. So our recommendation, that is employers, schools, agencies, that they develop policies that then recommend self-quarantining before they return into the general environment. So if you're planning a big family vacation, that was why we started making sure we started talking about this at the end of June and July, so that if your school starts mid-August, we wanted you and your family to be ready to return to school. If you're a teacher, the same guidance applies. We, again, have a responsibility to each other to really make sure that, no one is stopping us from traveling. No one is saying that it's a ban, but it's really to be thoughtful and intentional about, if I travel to a high-risk area for business or for, pleasure, then when I come back, I need to understand that I may have to go into quarantine in order to protect my community moving forward.
If a parent is sent home from work to self-quarantine, are their students expected to stay home under quarantine?
So I come back to, when I read this question, it would depend on the case investigation. So if it's the case scenario where the teacher, and again, as if a parent, so it sounded like it was a parent teacher, right? I mean, I was trying to figure this out. So if the parent or a teacher is a household contact to a case of COVID, meaning someone in their family, and then they're required to quarantine at home. The students that are in their classroom, so let's say I'm a teacher in a second grade or sixth grade, or, basically I'm a teacher. Essentially, those students are what we call a contact to me, who is a contact. And while they're an important person in the person's lives, they are not at risk for disease transmission. So in that case scenario, that classroom of students would not be required to quarantine. Now, if I'm the teacher and I'm the case, so I've been diagnosed with COVID-19 and sent home to isolate, then my students are contacts, and then they are required to quarantine. So I come back to kind of understanding what that scenario would look like, which is why I really want people not to make assessments and judgments on their own without the health department, because we often found at the beginning of, even when we started shutting down in March, that a lot of people were making determinations and assessment that were not accurate. Either we over quarantined or we under quarantined. And so our goal is to make sure that we are following the guidance, that we are appropriately isolating individuals who are ill and quarantining those who are close contacts, including the household and anyone who has spent more than 15 minutes within 6 feet.
Okay, and our next question is very similar to the one we just answered, but kind of reversed. If a student is sent home to quarantine, are parents expected to stay home from work in quarantine?
Well, it again depends on the case, but I have to come back to, if a child cannot stay home alone, I mean, again, if it's not a high school age student, but even then I'd question that, because if a child's being sent home to quarantine, the idea being is that they're supposed to be being monitored for 14 days for development of signs and symptoms of illness. So someone responsible, whether it's the parent or the guardian, needs to stay with that child to make sure that they remain well during that time frame. So that's different than the whole scenario of, are you quarantining the parent? Again, it's a contact to a contact, so not necessarily following the guise of the health department quarantining, but a parent or responsible individual should be there to care for that particular student if they're being quarantined, because if they become ill, someone needs to be able to help take the appropriate action with them. Remember, they have 14 days. The idea being that the reason they're home for 14 days is not just to put them in remote learning. It's not just to kind of put them in a timeout area. It's because we're concerned that they could develop signs and symptoms, and we want to lessen the risk of more exposure, as well as monitor them for signs and symptoms of development. If that situation were to occur and you're a family member and you're concerned, right? I have to take off work for this, right? I mean, this is a problem. This is the situation that's covered under the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. And they're, with the understanding that if a child is quarantined, the parent as the caregiver must be home with that child to care for the child. They're not being quarantined. They're there to care for their minor child.
Okay. We're going to move into our next category, which is PPE. So our first question is, what PPE specifically is required for the staff and students since social distancing cannot be maintained? Since the classrooms will have up to 20 kids per room, they will be within 6 feet for greater than 15 minutes. It places them in a higher risk situation. RPS 205 Marshall Middle School has 70% attending in person. Normal class size 30 at 70% is 21 students. RPS states it's trying to keep a maximum at 20 students.
So once again, all individuals in the school setting are required to wear face coverings or masks, regardless of when social distancing is available or not available. I think this becomes that kind of concept about, does that change the scenario? Some of the research says that almost, I'm going to say lessens the transmission by 80% or more. I mean, and that's significant. Now, when wearing a face covering, is not feasible for a medical condition, the student can wear a face shield. And staff, who we've talked about, the school nurses and other individuals that might be doing procedures on children with medically fragile or caring for children with COVID-like, they will be wearing an N95, which protects them, as well as, again, they'll be wearing a face shield and gown and gloves. Any faculty member that feels that a face covering, if they are also high risk and would want to wear that, they can wear both a face covering and a face shield as extra added protection in those environments. But we again would ask for the teachers, they should be maintaining 6 feet of social distancing. Yes, the students may be 3 or 4 feet apart, but you're going to know who's sitting within that 6 feet at the 2 rows ahead and the 2 rows behind, 2 rows to the sides, so that you know who's at greatest risk of a contact exposure.
Will families be informed if someone in their class or cohort has tested positive?
And this kind of reflected back, and we would be providing notification, but we will not be saying that Sandy Martell tested positive today. They will be identified that they've been exposed or they are a contact to a case and the instructions that they need to take. If there's a case in a particular school, we will then work with the school to then message the parent that a case was identified and appropriate actions were taken. It might say the second grade, classroom of Miss Brooks or whatever. But I think that understanding that everything will be done to protect the privacy and confidentiality of the individuals involved. But we will work to make sure that people understand what is going on in that school environment. Because I understand social media spreads a lot of rumors and incomplete information. And then we get the question of, well, if the second grade classroom had to close, why didn't the others close? Understanding that that's because they were cohorted, we understood the risk involved, and we took the appropriate action that was needed to quarantine the group at risk for COVID.
Who is going to monitor children wearing masks on the bus?
Oh, that, again, I've come back to, we're going to have signage posted, but every parent, guardian who brings their child to the bus stop should make sure that the child has their mask on as they get on the bus. Now, I know sometimes they can't wait, but again, the idea being the bus driver can remind them as they come on the bus, but the bus driver's primary responsibility is to ensure the safe transport of individuals. They cannot be watching, as children cross the street and coming on with a mask. Their primary role is to ensure the safety of the children when they are embarking on the bus and then getting off of the bus. We would not want to have an accident involving because we were looking at masks. So I come back to, this is the social norm and standard. We will have signage on the bus. We've understood from all the schools that they're going to be doing that. Some of them do have volunteers that may ride on the buses to remind the children. It depends upon the school setting. But we, again, as adults and leaders in our community have to, I'm going to say, model good behavior and make sure that we're wearing our masks. So if you're the parent that's kind of the bus stop person, put your mask on, make sure all the kids and say, okay, mask up, on the bus we go, have a great day. And then, when they come off, make sure mask on, have a great day, thanks bus driver, and away they go. Because we are all in this, really, truly. If we want to stay and begin to offer our in-person education, if we want to restore our economy, our livelihoods, it's all up to us to work together on this. And I've said before, we're not policing our way out of a pandemic. We have to adopt good behavior all on our own.
Districts that are supplying masks, did your office help them make selections? Could you go over proper fitting, cleaning, wearing, just procedures that some adults are not even aware of during your press conference?
We can do that. We've also, I know our Joint Information Center and our social media group has put out all kinds of little videos and links, pictures about how to wear. You might recognize Katie Kelly from one of our features about how to properly wear your mask. We will also, we can also put some links up onto the CDC. Washing facial masks in the washer and dryer is absolutely appropriate. But again, making sure that you know what it is. We do not recommend, obviously, washing the paper ones, but we will review that. And we understand that it will be hard for the first couple of weeks with some of the children coming in. There are some good ideas from, I'm going to say, some helpful tips from parents of smaller children about which ones they like around the ears, around that help their children keep that on them. Some schools are putting on the older children, not in the early childhood, because again, we have safety issues and concerns about lanyards or a clip that's similar to a mitten clip that we used to have in back in the day, so that their mask is clipped up, so if it falls and it doesn't fall on the floor, right? So these are all things that we're going to do, but we will work to put up some of that guidance. But I want to assure individuals there's no special procedure for washing facial masks. You can put them in with the laundry, but what you want to do is make sure that you have a supply so that your child has everyone for the day that they're doing in-person education.
We're going to move on to a new category about manipulatives and shared equipment. So our first question there is, the teachers I've talked with have gotten no direction from their districts on what they can and cannot have in their classrooms. Are there any recommendations from your office on this subject?
Well, Illinois State Board of Education has put out some guidance, and we did some additional guidance as well. Manipulatives within a cohort can be shared amongst that, but then sanitized between use. There are some alternatives. A couple of people have reached out about, again, you can have manipulatives in the classroom, maybe, and then a Ziploc bag for each child in that particular class, so that the likelihood that we're sharing objects amongst each other declines. This has been part of the push about school supplies, the big bin of crayons that we might have all shared during this time frame is not the best practice. And so trying to get those down to items that can be cleansed and washed or sanitized between use. So that's why you see kind of the idea about no soft plushy toys and things like that being used between. But you can do it in other ways. And I come back to I want to say that some of our long-term care facilities have kind of done some interesting things for tactile stimulation with people with sensory. They gave them towels, and that was their towel manipulative. And it was, they would wash them on a daily basis. They had a tag on them, but that was how they also kept their workspace, and also then for tactile stimulation. So that, again, they knew that that was an important concept to keep, but they had a way to clean and make sure that they were sanitized and kept amongst the individuals. So hard items that can be surface, blocks, I'm going to say, and it's been a while since I looked at all the manipulatives that are out there. Some of the hard, I'm going to say hard books that children read, the hard cover kinds of things can be used. Some of the stackable items. If you want to use manipulatives and you're doing things like, I'm going to say some of the trauma-informed for manipulation, by disposable pipe cleaners. And at the end of those fuzzy pipe cleaners, they can be discarded or put in a baggie in the children's desk that remain with them. The idea being that we want to encourage good sensory and neurodevelopment, but at the same time, we want to make sure that we limit the amount of sharing and potential cross-contamination. And if you're a teacher and that happens, just wipe down the crayon or take out that item out of service until you can sanitize it, because we know they're going to share.
They will. Will drinking fountains still be available for use?
So every school has a little bit different setup. And again, it's kind of like public health departments. I'll share a secret. Once you've seen one, you've only seen one. So once you've seen a school, you've only seen one. So some of them have been able to replace their drinking fountains with water bottle fillers, and those will remain open. The schools that don't have that will keep their water fountains open for people to fill their water containers, but will have signage up that they should not be drinking directly from the fountain. And those that have drinking fountains will be working through to have those sanitized on a regular basis throughout the day. And again, teaching students that this is not the time, but sending them with a disposable, a reusable, I shouldn't say disposable, water bottle that's theirs to use throughout the day. Because we know the beginning, especially the end of the summer, beginning of the fall, can often be very warm in some of our classroom settings. And hydration is just as important to help prevent, again, maintaining hydration in your immune system is important in the prevention against COVID infection as well.
Okay. We're going to move on to our final category of questions for today, and that is the metrics. So our first one from there is, as a parent, I'm still struggling with the decision of whether to send my children for in-person school and to daycare this fall. Could the health department provide more specific information that may inform parents' decision-making, such as case positivity rate by school zone and regional areas of concern that may relate to school zones? Could the health department also provide the most up-to-date information regarding overall trends for the county and whether the trends seen in recent weeks are reflective of accurate community transmission, testing capacity, or locations of concern. Could the health department please also provide information about the availability of testing in our region and the turnaround times, as well as the feasibility of broad community testing for students and school personnel? Dr. Martell, I also have a couple other questions in the same category I'm going to read before you answer.
Okay.
At what point would you recommend that a school or all Winnebago County schools close? Is it a certain positivity rate or so many positive cases in one school? What measures will each school in the districts use to decide whether to remain open, to go hybrid, or to go remote? Certain number of positives of students, of family members, of district employees, positivity rate in community, teachers' feedback on student learning, etc. And the final question for this one will be, what level of illness is okay or not okay for face-to-face learning? RPS seems to be the largest school district in the state, continuing to do daily elementary. What data do we have to make us think we can safely do this when most large districts have realized this isn't safe? That's a lot of questions.
There's a lot of mixed in there. So I come back to the metrics. First of all, we're going to, and again, the state guidance that just came out yesterday, it's going to be posted. I know it's backwards. Sorry about that. It's kind of like a mirror. So again, we talked about our weekly county case rates. We want them to be less than 50 per 100,000. So if you're watching, we put out a daily report. It's intended to be transparent so you can know what's going on. Weekly county overall case numbers increasing for 2 consecutive weeks. So I always come back to watch my epidemiologic curve. So those of you who watch that know, if my cases are continuing to increase in number of positivity, again, I'm concerned that there's more community transmission. One of the new areas that we're going to be looking at are cases increasing among youth. Now, if you've been following the trend line, you know that the largest number of cases are between those that are 20 and 29 years of age, and 30 and 39. They are the highest contributors overall. That's not to say we haven't had them in the younger grades or, the 0 to 10. So we're going to monitor that and see if there are increases going up in those areas and regions as well. We talked about the weekly test positivity rate. We want that below or equal to 5%. We've been hovering about 3.4, 3.2. And our neighboring counties have been similar. So then you start looking about, okay, so right now I'm going to say we're in a green light zone. I know we got all these colors going on, and I apologize, it's very confusing, but essentially, based on the metrics we have today, I feel confident that we can move to some in-person education. The metrics are driving that decision. The schools have put in all the mitigation strategies, and we'll continue to monitor. We can't just turn away from that. But we'll continue to monitor. If case rates increase, if our positivity rate increases, if the number of cases and percentage of cases among children rises, we will continue to take a look at that and then say, okay, maybe we have to shift into more remote learning. We'll go into those adaptive, plans and return from in-person to remote. I've talked about it maybe at the school level. For instance, we have seen the disparity that has occurred just when we talk about our communities of concern. We have hotspot zip codes, I'm going to call them, and we have zip codes with less disease transmission. But those same zip codes are also my communities at highest risk for educational failure, low academic achievement. They have other metrics that are driving some concerns with us versus my rural communities. And so again, we have come together as Rockford Public Schools, Winnebago County districts to say, we're going to come together, we're going to strategize. And there may be times when one school is going to have to go to all remote while others remain with their blended and hybrid. And there may be times when they can reopen back up. But understanding that it is, and this will make this challenging. I am not saying that it will not be challenging. I want people to understand that from the start, because you may have a child in one district for this and another child in another district. And not to mention, if you have children in college, you have a whole nother thing going on in your life. So trying to figure out how you balance that, where one school may be closed, another open, one in quarantine. We know that this is going to be challenging. We are trying to the best of our ability to communicate that to our business community as well, to understand that many of you are not only just employed by the educational system or healthcare, but you have other jobs, right? You might be a frontline worker. You might be working to let your employer know that, hey, my kid is returning back to in-person education. These are the plans. This is how it may have to work. I may have to go and pick up my child suddenly in the middle of a work day. And I know as an employer that we probably always in the past thought, oh, that's just too much for us. We're all learning how to have to navigate these challenging times during a pandemic. So the idea being, we will look at the metrics. We will publish those metrics. Illinois Department of Public Health is also, I believe, has already opened up this metric site related to school openings and closures. But I really want to come back to, that is a local decision that's made with our metrics, with our educational system and our leadership on that particular, where we're going, how we have to maneuver together. And again, we will do it as a team so that the rest of the members of the team know as well. I think that was the challenge in March when we had to do some. It would be like the rumor mill would spread very quickly like wildfire, that there were cases all over. That was not necessarily the case. And so I have taxed our Joint Information Center and all of the communication specialists located with the schools so that we can effectively and explain why we're taking a particular step with one school that may be different than another, so that at any time you can follow the numbers with us and you'll understand the rationale. And so the idea being that we are going to respond locally and we are going to continue to monitor these metrics throughout the school year. We know these challenges. We appreciate everyone's patience as we work through the challenge. I've said from day one, we're in a constantly evolving situation. We believe our metrics reflect well at the present time, and they are different metrics than other counties that have made a choice not to go to offer an in-person education option.
Okay, and our final question of the day. The numbers of children testing positive for COVID-19 since schools began opening are rising. How many children need to be testing positive for RPS 205 to go all online?
Well, that's that same famous answer I just gave. I don't believe that you will see an all RPS solution that says every school in RPS. It will be very school-centric and focused based on the numbers of that particular school, of that particular community area, and what else is going on, so that we can make the most effective decision to protect the health and safety while supporting in-person education. That has been our commitment from the start, to be able to offer that option to our families, to understand that many of our children need that as an option that's offered. That's how they learn best, and to be able to offer that, but in a safe environment where we are managing at the highest level of the mitigation strategies.
Okay, that wraps up our questions that we've received.
Do we have anything in the chat boxes?
Not that I can see from my perspective.
Okay. Well, I want to thank everyone for tuning in and for submitting your questions. They were very thought-provoking, and we tried to group as many as we could together that made sense to group them together. Clearly, we have more communication that needs to happen from our leadership teams that are working in the schools from the academic and educational standpoint. But I want parents to know that your schools have worked very, very hard, and the teachers are looking very forward to seeing the students back in education, in person. They're prepared for their remote learning environments as well. And I hope that we are able to start this off on a positive note and a good school year for all involved. So thank you again for your time and attention and all the work that you have done. We would not be here today if all of you had not practiced masking, hand washing, sanitizing of frequently touched surfaces, staying home when you're sick, and maintaining those social distances. So we appreciate it. We wouldn't be here without you.
All right, thanks everyone.
Thank you.